June 6, 1944, 9:45 a.m. The most powerful man in Europe was sound asleep, drugged into oblivion, while outside his bedroom. A terrified general stood frozen with his fist inches from the door, knowing that what waited on the other side of that knock would decide the fate of millions. Yet equally certain that waking the sleeping dictator might cost him his life. It was 23 minutes before 10 o'clock on the morning of June 6, 1944, and Colonel General Alfred Jodl had already been awake for nearly 5 hours, each minute more excruciating than the last. The Alpine air drifting through the windows of the Berghof, Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, a cruel contrast to the information burning in Jodl's mind. Behind him, two young officers stood at attention, their uniforms crisp despite the early hour, their faces drained of color. They knew what Jodl knew. They understood what he was about to do, and more importantly, what he was risking by doing it. The hallway stretched in both directions, eerily quiet for a headquarters that should have been erupting in controlled chaos. Paintings lined the walls, spoils of war from conquered nations, their subjects frozen in moments of triumph or contemplation, oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. A grandfather clock at the far end ticked away seconds that felt like hours. Somewhere below, kitchen staff prepared breakfast, unaware that the course of human history was being determined one floor above them by a man who couldn't bring himself to knock on a door. Jodl had served in the German military for decades. He'd fought in the Great War, survived the chaos of the Weimar Republic, climbed the ranks through skill and political savvy. He'd seen combat, witnessed death, made decisions that sent thousands of men into battle, but nothing in his long career had prepared him for this moment. Standing outside the bedroom of a sleeping dictator, holding information that could not wait, yet knowing that delivering it would unleash a fury he could scarcely imagine. The reports had started arriving at 5:30 to that morning. Jodl remembered the exact time because he'd been drinking his second cup of coffee when the first communication officer burst into his temporary office, his face flushed from running. "General, urgent traffic from France. Multiple reports. Airborne landings, paratroops, thousands of them." Jodl had set down his coffee cup with exaggerated care, a strange detail that would stick with him for years afterward. The cup made a soft clink against the saucer, a delicate sound that seemed to mark the boundary between one world and another. The reports had multiplied after that, each one more urgent than the last. American paratroopers dropping across the Cotentin Peninsula. British airborne forces seizing bridges and crossroads inland from the coast. Gliders landing in fields, disgorging troops and equipment. Then came reports of naval activity. Ships, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, materializing out of the pre-dawn darkness off the Normandy coast. The coastal defense batteries reported muzzle flashes from naval guns stretching from horizon to horizon, a constellation of deadly stars that began systematically demolishing German positions, with a precision that spoke to months of planning. By 6:15, the naval bombardment was in full fury, shells weighing as much as a small car screamed out of the sky, pulverizing concrete bunkers that had taken months to build, turning defensive positions into craters, killing men who'd been eating breakfast or writing letters home. By 7 o'clock, the first landing craft were grinding onto the beaches. Utah Beach on the eastern shore of the Cotentin Peninsula, Omaha Beach, where American boys from farms and cities were running into a wall of machine gun fire that turned The surf read, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach, where British and Canadian forces pushed forward with grim determination. Each report had been verified, cross-checked, confirmed. This was not a raid. This was not a probe. This was the invasion. The moment that every German officer in France had been dreading and preparing for. The moment when the Western Allies would finally attempt to break into Fortress Europe and establish a foothold on the continent. And the one man who needed to know about it. The one man whose authorization was required to unleash the armored reserves that might stop it, was unconscious behind a locked door, his system flooded with barbiturates prescribed by his personal physician. Jodl raised his fist again. The wood of the door was dark, ornately carved, probably looted from some French chateau or Austrian palace. He could hear nothing from the other side. The Führer's sleeping quarters were well insulated, designed to provide him with the absolute silence he demanded. Hitler's sleep schedule had become legendary within the inner circle, a source of constant frustration and dark humor among the staff. He stayed up until 3 or 4 in the morning, holding forth to whoever was still awake about art, architecture, his plans for rebuilding Berlin, his theories on history and race and destiny. Then he'd retire, taking a cocktail of medications prepared by Dr. Theodor Morel, a man whose medical credentials were questionable, but whose loyalty was absolute. The pills were strong, brutally effective. Once Hitler took them, he was essentially unreachable until late morning, sometimes early afternoon. Officers who tried to wake him for emergencies had faced explosive rage. Some had been reassigned to punishment posts on the Eastern Front, where life expectancy was measured in weeks. Others had simply vanished, their fates whispered about but never confirmed. The message was clear. The Führer's sleep was sacred. Disturb it at your peril. But this was the invasion. This was what they'd been preparing for. What every strategic decision for the past year had been building toward. And with each passing minute, Allied forces were consolidating their positions, bringing more troops ashore, pushing inland, establishing the beachhead that would become the platform for the liberation of Europe. Jodl knew the doctrine. He'd helped write parts of it. The critical window for defeating an amphibious invasion was narrow, measured in hours, perhaps a day at most. Hit the enemy while they were still disorganized, still vulnerable, still confined to the beaches. Bring up your armored reserves, your panzers, and crush them before they could establish defensive positions. Drive them back into the sea, but the armored reserves that could do that. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler-Jugend positioned near Le Soux. The Panzer Lehr Division near Le Mans. The 21st Panzer Division near Com. All of them were bound by standing orders that only the Führer could modify. They could not move without his express authorization. Local commanders had some flexibility, but committing the strategic reserve, the units that represented Germany's best chance of defeating the invasion, that required Hitler's personal approval. And Hitler was asleep. Jodl knocked. The sound seemed absurdly loud in the quiet hallway, 3 sharp raps that echoed off the walls. He waited, counting seconds in his head. Nothing. No response. No movement. No indication that anyone inside had heard. He knocked again, harder this time, his knuckles beginning to hurt from the impact against the solid wood. Mein Führer, he called out, keeping his voice firm but respectful. Urgent news from France. Critical situation. Mein Führer, still nothing. Behind him, one of the junior officers shifted his weight. the creak of his boot leather loud in the silence. Jodl didn't turn around. He knocked a third time, abandoning any pretense of gentle persuasion, pounding on the door with real force. Mein Führer, the invasion has begun. I must speak with you immediately. His voice was rising now, military authority overriding the fear. Minutes crawled past. Jodl was raising his fist for another assault on the door when he heard it. Movement from inside. Shuffling footsteps. A muttered curse in a voice thick with sleep and anger. The door swung open. Adolf Hitler stood there, and for a moment Jodl saw not the master of Europe, not the dictator whose decisions controlled the lives of hundreds of millions, but a middle-aged man rudely awakened, disoriented and furious. Hitler wore a nightshirt that hung loosely on his frame. His hair, usually carefully combed to hide the thinning spots, stood up in irregular tufts. His face was puffy, his skin sallow under the morning light, his eyes struggling to focus. The famous mustache looked absurd without the context of the uniform and the carefully staged public appearances. He was 54 years old but looked a decade older in that moment. The accumulated stress of 5 years of total war etched into every line of his face. This had better be important. Jodl. The voice was rough, gravelly, lacking the hypnotic quality that characterized his speeches. This had better be worth waking me for. Jodl drew himself to attention. A reflexive gesture that gave him a moment to choose his words. Mein Führer, the invasion has begun. Normandy. Multiple landing sites across approximately 50 miles of coastline. Airborne drops inland. Massive naval bombardment. Landing craft bringing troops ashore in waves. The reports indicate this is a major operation, possibly the main invasion. Hitler stared at him. 3 seconds passed, maybe 4, maybe 5. Jodl had learned to read the Führer's expressions, a survival skill that every officer close to him developed. He expected shock, perhaps, or immediate anger at the Allies for their audacity, or fear at the implications. What he saw instead was something he hadn't anticipated. Hitler's eyes sharpened, the fog of sleep burning away. His posture straightened. His mouth curved into an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but suggested something close to satisfaction, even vindication. So, Hitler said, his voice gaining strength, "They've finally done it. They've shown us where they want us to look." He turned and walked back into the room, leaving the door open behind him, an implicit invitation for Jodl to follow. Jodl stepped inside, the 2 junior officers remaining in the hallway. The bedroom was large but not ostentatious, dominated by a 4-poster bed with rumpled sheets and a window that offered a spectacular view of the Bavarian Alps. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating mountains that stood eternal and indifferent, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer season. Hitler walked to the window, his hands clasping behind his back in a characteristic pose. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the mountains, seemingly in no hurry despite the urgency of the situation. "Normandy," he said finally, almost to himself. "Normandy, not Pas-de-Calais. Interesting. Very interesting." Jodl waited. He'd attended hundreds of briefings with Hitler, learned the rhythms of how the man thought, or at least how he appeared to think. Interrupting when Hitler was working through a problem was dangerous. Better to let him process, let him speak, let him arrive at conclusions on his own timetable. "This is Eisenhower trying to be clever," Hitler continued, still looking out at the mountains. "He wants us to commit everything to Normandy. Rush our reserves to the coast, Throw everything at stopping this landing. Then, when we're fully committed, when our panzers are locked in battle in Normandy, that's when he'll launch the real invasion at Calais. The shortest route. The logical route. The route that actually makes strategic sense. He turned to face Jodl, and his expression was one of someone who just solved a complex puzzle. Don't you see, Jodl? Normandy is the feint. It has to be. Look at the geography. Calais is barely 20 miles from England across the narrowest part of the Channel. Normandy is over 100 miles. Calais gives them the shortest supply lines. The quickest route to our industrial heartland in the Ruhr. Normandy offers them nothing but difficult terrain and extended supply lines. From a purely strategic standpoint, an invasion at Normandy makes no sense as the main effort. Therefore, it isn't the main effort. It's brilliant, really. Sacrifice thousands of men in Normandy to trick us into committing our reserves. Then hit us where it really matters. Jodl had the latest reports clutched in his hand. He'd read them multiple times during the long wait for Hitler to wake. The scale of what was happening in Normandy didn't match a diversionary attack. The number of ships, the number of aircraft, the intensity of the naval bombardment, the depth of the airborne penetration inland, everything suggested that this was the main event. Not a sideshow. But Hitler was already moving, energized now, calling for his aides, demanding his uniform, ordering coffee. "Get me everything," Hitler said, buttoning his shirt with quick, efficient movements. "Every report from France. I want to know ship numbers, troop estimates, exactly where they're landing, what units we've identified. Get me Keitel. Get me the latest intelligence assessments on Allied dispositions in England. If this is a feint, there should be clear evidence of major forces still waiting across from Calais." And Jodl, he paused, looking directly at the general. "No precipitous actions. We do not commit the Panzer reserves until we're certain about what we're facing. Understood?" That word, commit. Jodl felt something cold settle in his stomach. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, was composed of fanatical young soldiers, well-trained and well-equipped, positioned within striking distance of the invasion beaches. The Panzer Lehr Division was the elite of the elite, the demonstration unit that represented the best the German army could field. Both divisions had the mobility and firepower to devastate an invasion force that was still organizing on the beaches, still vulnerable, still establishing its supply lines. But both divisions would sit idle, waiting for an authorization that might not come. The morning briefing began at 10:45. Over 5 hours after the first Allied paratrooper had touched French soil. The main conference room at the Berghof had been hastily prepared. Maps spread across the large oak table. Communications officers standing by with the latest updates. Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, had arrived from his quarters, his uniform immaculate despite the early hour. Other staff officers filled the remaining chairs. Everyone's attention focused on the maps of France spread before them. Hitler entered the room with purpose, his earlier grogginess completely gone. He approached the map table, studying the markings that indicated the known extent of the Allied landings. Red pins showed the approximate landing zones, stretching along the Normandy coast from the Cotentin Peninsula in the west to the area around Caen in the east. Blue pins marked known German positions. Black pins indicated areas where contact had been lost. Positions that had either been overrun or destroyed by the naval bombardment. "Brief me," Hitler commanded, his eyes never leaving the map. Jodl stepped forward, using a pointer to indicate specific areas. 5 confirmed landing zones, mean Führer. The Allies are using codenames for them, which we've intercepted from radio traffic. Utah Beach here on the eastern coast of the Cotentin Peninsula. Initial reports suggest American forces, relatively light resistance. They're pushing inland. Omaha Beach here, also Americans, much heavier resistance from our 352nd Infantry Division. But the enemy is still advancing despite significant casualties. He moved the pointer eastward. Gold Beach, Juno Beach, and Sword Beach, extending from Romanches to Ouistreham. British and Canadian forces. They've achieved penetration in several areas, linked up some of their landing zones, and are pushing toward airborne forces, both American and British, dropped throughout the night behind the beaches. They've seized key bridges, blocked roads, created chaos in our rear areas. The scope is substantial. Mein Führer. Hitler studied the map in silence. Officers around the table waited, barely breathing. Finally, Hitler spoke. How many ships? Jodl consulted his notes. The coastal observers report hundreds at minimum, Mein Führer. Perhaps over 1,000. The horizon was covered with them at first light. Everything from battleships to small landing craft. The naval bombardment has been devastating. How many aircraft? Hitler asked. Air superiority appears to be absolute. Keitel interjected. Our fighters are outnumbered at least 10 to 1, possibly 20 to 1. The skies are thick with allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transport planes. Any movement in daylight is being attacked immediately. How many troops ashore? Hitler's finger traced the coastline on the map. Jodl checked the latest estimate, which had been updated minutes before the briefing began. As of 10:30 this morning, approximately 60,000, possibly higher. The number is climbing steadily. They're bringing in troops, vehicles, artillery, supplies. At current rates, we estimate they'll have over 100,000 by nightfall. Hitler straightened, stepping back from the map. And Pas de Calais? What's the intelligence from there? An intelligence officer stepped forward, a thin man with glasses who handled signals intelligence. Mein Führer, we continue to intercept significant radio traffic from southeastern England. In the areas across from Calais, traffic patterns suggest a major force still in position there. We've identified what appears to be 1st U.S. Army Group, commanded by General Patton, with multiple divisions. They appear to be in staging areas, not embarking. Hitler's expression shifted to something approaching triumph. There, you see, Patton, the Americans' best general. They're keeping him in reserve for the real invasion. This confirms everything. Normandy is substantial. Yes, larger than we might have hoped. But it's designed to pull our attention, to make us commit our reserves. Then Patton comes across at Calais with fresh divisions, and we have nothing left to stop him. What Hitler didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 1st U.S. Army Group didn't exist. It was a phantom, a masterpiece of allied deception. Dummy tanks made of inflatable rubber, fake radio traffic, double agents feeding false information. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan, was working perfectly, convincing the Germans that a massive force sat waiting in England for a second invasion. And because Hitler wanted to believe it. Because it fit his preconceptions about how strategy should work. He accepted the phantom as reality. Jodl tried again, carefully. Mein Führer, Field Marshal Rommel's headquarters, is requesting authorization to move the Panzer reserves toward the coast. Every hour of delay allows the enemy to consolidate their beachhead, to bring up anti-tank weapons, to establish defensive positions. If we strike now, while they're still vulnerable, no. Hitler's voice was flat, brooking no argument. We do not commit the panzers to Normandy. Not yet. This is exactly what Eisenhower wants. He wants us to rush our reserves into Normandy, lock them in battle there, exhaust them against his beachhead while he prepares the real blow at Calais. We will not be fooled by this deception. We will wait. We will contain the Normandy landing, prevent it from expanding. But we will not commit our strategic reserve until we know with certainty where the main invasion is coming. The room fell silent. Several officers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Jodl knew what they were thinking because he was thinking it too. The scale of the Normandy landing didn't suggest a feint. The resources being committed, the intensity of the effort, the depth of planning evident in the coordination between airborne forces, naval bombardment, and amphibious assault. All of it pointed to a main effort, not a diversion. But Hitler had made up his mind, and once Hitler made up his mind, changing it was nearly impossible. The briefing continued for another hour, reviewing every detail, every unit position, every report from the front. By noon, new estimates put Allied troops ashore at over 70,000 and climbing. German commanders in Normandy were sending increasingly desperate requests for reinforcements. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to the beaches to attack without Hitler's specific authorization, had launched a counterattack toward Sword Beach in the early afternoon. The attack had initial success, reaching almost to the coast. But then British anti-tank guns and naval artillery had stopped it cold. The division commander reported heavy losses and requested immediate support from other panzer divisions. Hitler's response, when it came, revealed the depth of his conviction. Tell the 21st Panzer to hold their positions, contain the beachhead, do not allow it to expand. But we are not committing the 12th SS Panzer or Panzerlehr. Those divisions remain in reserve. They do not move without my direct authorization. Jodl made one final attempt. Mein Führer, with all respect, if Normandy is the main invasion, every hour we delay gives them. It's not the main invasion. Jodl, Hitler's voice was patient, almost condescending. The tone of a teacher correcting a slow student. Use logic. Use strategic thinking. Calais is 120 miles from London. Normandy is over 200. Calais is 150 miles from the raw industrial heartland. Normandy is 300. Calais has excellent port facilities at Boulogne and Calais itself. Normandy's major ports are either too small or too heavily fortified to be useful. From every strategic standpoint, Normandy makes no sense as the primary invasion route. Therefore, it is not the primary invasion. This is Eisenhower being clever. We will be more clever. We will see through his deception and be ready when the real blow falls. The logic was immaculate. The logic was also catastrophically wrong. But Hitler had built his entire worldview on trusting his intuition over conventional military wisdom. And that intuition had been proven correct before, spectacularly so. France in 1940, when his generals said the attack through the Ardennes was too risky, and he'd overruled them and won in 6 weeks. The early stages of Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, when his generals said the Red Army would be impossible to defeat, and his forces had driven to the gates of Moscow. His track record of defying military convention, and succeeding had made him certain of his own genius, unable to accept that this time the conventional wisdom was correct. And so the panzers sat motionless while the Allies continued landing. By 6 o'clock that evening, more than 130,000 troops were ashore. By midnight, the number would exceed 156,000. The beachhead was expanding, linking up, solidifying. German positions were being systematically reduced. Allied engineers were clearing beach obstacles, blowing up the extensive fortifications that Rommel had spent months constructing. Supplies were coming ashore in vast quantities, stacked on the beaches, loaded into trucks, distributed inland. Hitler took dinner that evening in the Berghof's dining room, a long, wood-paneled space with windows overlooking the mountains. The meal was his customary vegetarian fare, prepared exactly to his specifications. Several guests who'd been invited days earlier, before anyone knew the invasion was coming, sat around the table, along with staff members and aides. The conversation was surreal in its normality. Someone mentioned a recent opera performance in Berlin. Another guest discussed production figures from the aircraft factories, which showed some improvement. Hitler spoke at length about his plans for rebuilding Berlin after the war. The grand boulevards modeled on Paris. The massive domed hall that would hold 180,000 people. The triumphal arch that would dwarf the Arc de Triomphe. He seemed relaxed, almost cheerful, gesturing with his fork as he described his architectural vision. Only once did he directly reference the invasion, and when he did, his tone was casual, almost dismissive. "They've made their move," he said, cutting a piece of vegetable. "Now we wait to see what they do next. I suspect within a week, perhaps two, we'll see the real invasion at Calais. Then everyone will understand why we held back our reserves." Patience in warfare is a virtue. Knowing when not to commit is as important as knowing when to commit. Across the table, an aide who'd just come from the communications room sat very still. In his pocket was a piece of paper with the latest estimate. 140,000 Allied troops ashore. And the number was still climbing. He caught Jodl's eye, gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. Neither man said anything. The dinner continued, the conversation flowing around the subject of the invasion as if it were a minor inconvenience, rather than a potentially war-ending development. That night, as Hitler retired once again to his bedroom and his sleeping pills, the Allied beachhead stretched approximately 10 miles along the coast, and penetrated inland in places as deep as 5 or 6 miles. More than 156,000 troops were ashore, the exact figure that would be recorded in the history books. They'd brought tanks, artillery, half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, supplies of every description. They'd established field hospitals, ammunition dumps, command posts, communications networks. They'd captured dozens of German strongpoints, taken thousands of prisoners. They'd secured the crucial bridges and crossroads inland that would allow them to expand the beachhead. They'd achieved everything the plan called for, and in some areas exceeded expectations. And the German Panzer divisions that could have hit them while they were still vulnerable, still organizing, still establishing their defensive perimeter, sat motionless in their assembly areas, engines cold, crews frustrated and confused, waiting for authorization that wouldn't come. Hitler went to sleep that night still believing he'd made the brilliant decision, still convinced that Normandy was an elaborate feint, still certain that the real invasion was yet to come. June 7th brought more of the same. The beachhead expanded in every direction. More troops poured ashore. More supplies accumulated on the beaches. More vehicles churned inland through the Norman countryside. The Allies pushed toward their initial objectives, taking villages, securing key terrain, establishing defensive positions in depth. Naval gunfire continued to support the ground forces, the big guns of the battleships and cruisers reaching miles inland to pulverize any German position that tried to organize a coherent defense. Hitler's daily briefing on June 7th showed a beachhead that had grown substantially overnight. The Allies had linked up several of their landing zones. American forces from Utah Beach had pushed inland toward St. Mire-Église and were working to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula. British and Canadian forces had captured Bayeux and were pushing toward Rommel's headquarters city. The beachhead was no longer a tenuous toehold. It was a foothold, and soon it would be much more. And still, Hitler held back the panzers. He continued to insist that Normandy was a diversion, that committing the reserves would be falling into Eisenhower's trap. He kept substantial forces near Pas de Calais, waiting for the phantom invasion that existed only in carefully crafted Allied deception plans. It wasn't until June 8th, 2 full days after the invasion began, that Hitler finally authorized the movement of some reserve units toward Normandy. Not because he'd changed his assessment. He still believed Calais was the real target. But the situation in Normandy had deteriorated to the point where he couldn't ignore it entirely. He released some units, but not all. The 12th SS Panzer Division received authorization to move, but with caveats. Panzer Lehr was released, but only after Hitler personally modified the unit's orders multiple times, second-guessing the routes, the assembly areas, the tactical deployments. Other units remained locked near Calais, still waiting for the invasion that would never come. And by then, the window had closed. The Allies had established air superiority so complete that moving armored columns in daylight was suicide. Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons, and Thunderbolts prowled the skies looking for targets. Any German column that moved during daylight hours was attacked relentlessly. The aircraft diving out of the sun. Rockets and cannon fire turning tanks into burning wrecks, scattering infantry, destroying supply trucks. The panzer divisions that finally did move toward Normandy traveled only at night, creeping through the darkness, hiding in forests and villages during the day, camouflaging their vehicles, losing time and men and equipment to the constant air attacks. Units that should have reached the front in hours took days, arriving piecemeal, in small battle groups too weak to launch the kind of massive, coordinated counterattack that might have driven the Allies back. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B responsible for defending northern France, had been absent on June 6th. He'd been in Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday, convinced that the weather was too poor for an invasion. When the news reached him, he'd raced back to France, driving through the night in his staff car, pushing his driver to dangerous speeds on the dark roads. He arrived on June 7th to find a situation that was already critical and deteriorating by the hour. Rommel had spent months preparing for this moment. He'd personally inspected hundreds of miles of coastal defenses, ordered the emplacement of millions of mines and beach obstacles, positioned his forces to respond quickly to any landing. But his entire defensive strategy had assumed that when the invasion came, he'd be allowed to use the panzer reserves immediately to hit the Allies while they were still disorganized on the beaches. still vulnerable to a determined armored counterattack. Hitler's decision to hold back those reserves shattered Rommel's plans completely. On June 9th, Rommel composed a carefully worded message to the Führer's headquarters. He laid out the situation in stark terms. The Allies were consolidating their beachhead. They were bringing in reinforcements faster than German forces could interdict them. Allied air power made movement in daylight impossible. Allied naval gunfire made coastal positions untenable. Without massive reinforcements, without the full commitment of the Panzer reserves, the beachhead could not be eliminated. Every day that passed made the Allied position stronger, more difficult to reduce. Hitler's response came back the same day, terse and uncompromising. Hold all positions. No withdrawals. Contain the enemy beachhead. Strategic reserves will be committed when the overall situation clarifies. Rommel read the message twice, then looked at his chief of staff, Hans Speidel. He still believes Calais is coming, Rommel said quietly. He's going to wait until it's impossible to stop them. And by then, it will be too late. It was a prophetic assessment. Hitler's conviction that Normandy was a feint persisted for weeks. Even as the evidence mounted that this was the only invasion, the main effort, the decisive battle for France. Even as the Allies poured division after division into the beachhead. Even as they broke out and began the drive across France, Hitler kept forces near Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The Allied deception operation had been brilliantly conceived and executed. Phantom armies commanded by real generals. Radio traffic suggesting massive forces. Double agents providing false intelligence that confirmed German preconceptions. And because Hitler wanted to believe in a second invasion. Because it fit his understanding of how strategy should work. He believed in the phantom long after reality should have shattered the illusion. On June 17th, Hitler agreed to meet with Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, at a bunker complex near Margeville in northern France. It was Hitler's first visit to France since the victory tour of 1940, and he arrived by car, refusing to fly because Allied air superiority made flying too dangerous. The meeting took place in a concrete bunker, stuffy and uncomfortable. Maps spread across tables. The atmosphere tense from the beginning. Rommel laid out the situation with characteristic directness. The Allies now had well over 500,000 troops in France. They controlled a beachhead that stretched nearly 80 miles along the coast, and penetrated 15 to 20 miles inland in places. They were bringing in supplies faster than the Germans could destroy them. German forces were being systematically ground down by constant Allied attacks, supported by overwhelming air power and naval gunfire. Casualties were mounting. Replacements weren't arriving. Equipment losses couldn't be made good. The situation was, in Rommel's careful phrasing, extremely serious. Hitler listened, standing at the map table, occasionally asking questions, his face expressionless. When Rommel finished, Hitler responded, and his response showed how completely he detached from the reality of the military situation. The solution, he said, is conceptually simple. We hold every meter of ground. Every position becomes a fortress. No retreats, no withdrawals, no elastic defense. We make them pay for every inch they take. We exhaust them, bleed them, show them that fortress Europe cannot be conquered. Von Rundstedt, the old Prussian aristocrat who'd served in the Kaiser's army, couldn't remain silent. Mein Führer, that strategy means we sacrifice the army in France. If we cannot maneuver, if we cannot conduct withdrawals to more defensible positions, The Allies will destroy our forces piecemeal. We need flexibility to preserve our strength. Hitler's face flushed, his hands beginning to tremble. A sign that those who knew him recognized as the prelude to an explosion. Withdraw to where? Von Rundstedt? To Germany? You want to give them France without a real fight? Every time we retreat, it encourages them. Every time we give ground voluntarily, it shows weakness. We hold everything. That's not a suggestion. It's an order. Rommel tried a different approach, his voice carefully neutral. Mein Führer, perhaps the situation requires more than a military solution. Perhaps we could explore political options. Approach the British and Americans separately from the Soviets. They must have concerns about Soviet expansion into Europe. Perhaps a negotiated settlement, a separate peace in the West, allowing us to concentrate all our forces against the Bolshevik threat in the East. For a moment, absolute silence filled the bunker. Then Hitler exploded. Negotiated settlement? Separate peace? With Churchill? With Roosevelt? They've publicly committed to unconditional surrender. They want to destroy Germany, to reduce us to a third-rate power, to eliminate us as a factor in European affairs. There is no political solution. There is no negotiating with them. There is only victory or annihilation. We fight. We hold. We win. Those are the only options. The meeting deteriorated rapidly after that. Hitler accused his generals of defeatism, of lacking the will to win, of not understanding the larger political and ideological struggle that transcended mere military considerations. He brought up 1940 again, how everyone had doubted his plan to attack France through the Ardennes, and he'd been proven spectacularly right. He talked about new weapons in development, the V-1 flying bombs that had just started hitting London, spreading terror among the civilian population. He mentioned the V-2 rockets that would follow, unstoppable, devastating. He referenced new jet fighters that would sweep Allied aircraft from the skies, new submarines with revolutionary propulsion systems, wonder weapons that would turn the tide of the war. Rommel and von Rundstedt left the meeting knowing nothing had changed. Hitler would continue to insist on holding every position. He would continue to refuse any strategic withdrawals. He would continue to believe that willpower and determination could overcome material inferiority. They drove back to their headquarters in silence, both men understanding that the war in the West was effectively lost, that the only question remaining was how long it would take, and how many lives would be consumed in the process. Back in Normandy, the grinding attritional battle continued. German units fought hard, often with great skill and courage. Individual commanders won tactical victories, stopped Allied advances, launched successful local counterattacks, but the mathematics of attrition were inexorable. For every German tank, there were 5 Allied tanks. For every German aircraft, there were 20 Allied aircraft. For every German shell fired, the Allies fired 50. The material balance was overwhelmingly in favor of the Allies, and in a war of attrition, material matters. Through July and into August, the battle raged. The Americans broke out of the beachhead with Operation Cobra, a massive assault that shattered German lines and sent American armored columns racing across France. German forces tried to counterattack at Mortain, following Hitler's orders to cut off the American breakthrough, but the attack failed disastrously, caught in the open by Allied air power and destroyed. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in the Falaise pocket, surrounded and systematically annihilated. Paris fell on August 25th. Allied forces crossed the Seine. By September, they were approaching the German border. The campaign that Hitler had insisted would end with the Allies driven back into the sea had instead ended with the liberation of France and the destruction of German Army Group B as an effective fighting force. And through it all, Hitler's explanation for every setback remained consistent: betrayal, incompetence, lack of will among his generals. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted at his headquarters. In East Prussia, the blast killed several people, but left Hitler with only minor injuries. His response to the assassination attempt revealed everything about how he viewed the military situation. The problem wasn't his strategy. The problem wasn't his refusal to allow withdrawals or his insistence on holding untenable positions. The problem was treason, betrayal, weakness, and disloyalty among the officer corps. The purge that followed was savage. Thousands of officers were arrested. Many were tortured. Some were hanged with piano wire, their deaths filmed for Hitler to watch. The executions went on for months, consuming not just the actual plotters, but anyone suspected of disloyalty. Anyone who'd ever questioned Hitler's decisions. Anyone whose commitment to the Nazi cause seemed less than absolute. The officer corps, already stretched thin by 5 years of war, was gutted. Experienced commanders were replaced with political loyalists, whose primary qualification was fanaticism rather than competence. Hitler's paranoia, already intense, became complete and all-consuming. He trusted no one. He questioned every report. He assumed every setback was the result of sabotage or cowardice, rather than the logical consequence of strategic decisions. He retreated deeper into his bunker mentality, literally and figuratively, spending more time in underground command posts, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, increasingly isolated from reality. By the autumn of 1944, Allied forces were pressing against the German border from France in the west. While Soviet armies advanced from the east, Germany was being crushed between two massive military forces, each vastly superior in men and material. The rational strategic response would have been to seek some kind of negotiated settlement, to try to split the Allied coalition, to preserve something from the wreckage. But rationality had long since departed Hitler's decision-making process. Instead, he launched one final offensive in the west, the Ardennes Offensive of December 1944. Better known as the Battle of the Bulge, it was a desperate gamble, throwing Germany's last strategic reserves against the Americans in Belgium, hoping to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, create a crisis that might force the Western Allies to negotiate. The offensive achieved initial surprise and made some gains, but it ultimately failed, consuming the last German reserves in a battle that Germany couldn't afford to fight and couldn't win. Years later, historians would endlessly debate the what-ifs of D-Day. What if Hitler had released the panzers immediately on June 6th? What if he'd allowed Rommel to position the armored reserves closer to the coast? What if he'd accepted from the beginning that Normandy was the main invasion, and committed everything to stopping it? The consensus among most military historians is that even with optimal German decisions, D-Day probably still would have succeeded. Allied material superiority was too great. Allied air dominance was too complete. Allied planning was too thorough. The deception too effective. The execution too professional. But the beachhead would have been smaller. The casualties would have been higher. The breakout would have taken longer. The war might have extended into 1946 instead of ending in May 1945. Hitler's decisions on June 6th and in the days that followed didn't determine whether D-Day would succeed, but they certainly determined how quickly and how completely it would succeed. But Hitler never accepted that analysis. To his final days in the Führerbunker in Berlin in April 1945, with Soviet shells falling on the city above him, with his empire in ruins and his armies destroyed, he maintained that the problem had never been his decisions. The problem was always someone else's failure to properly execute his brilliant strategy. The problem was betrayal by weak generals. The problem was sabotage by traitors. The problem was the German people failing to be worthy of his leadership on June 6, 1944, when his staff finally woke him and informed him that the invasion had begun. His first reaction had been satisfaction. He thought he was seeing through a lie deception. He thought he was being strategically clever by holding back his reserves. He thought he was setting a trap that would ensnare Eisenhower and the Allied High Command. He was wrong about all of it, catastrophically and completely wrong. But he never admitted it, not to his generals, not to his inner circle, not to himself. He went to his death in that Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945, still blaming others. Still believing he'd been betrayed rather than understanding that his own certainty, his own refusal to accept evidence that contradicted his assumptions, his own conviction that his intuition was superior to military logic, had been the ultimate betrayal of the nation he claimed to serve. On that peaceful June morning at the Berghof, standing in his nightshirt looking out at the timeless Bavarian Alps, he'd said, "So they've shown their hand." He believed he was the one holding the winning cards. He believed he understood the game better than anyone else at the table. He believed his genius would carry the day, just as it had in France in 1940, just as it had in the early days of Barbarossa. He was wrong. The game was already over. He just didn't realize it yet. 156,000 Allied troops were ashore on that first day, and more were coming, wave after wave, an inexorable tide of men and material that would sweep across France, liberate Europe, and bring the Third Reich to its knees. And Hitler, the man who styled himself as the greatest strategic genius of the age, the man who defied conventional military wisdom and won, the man who trusted his intuition above all else, had made precisely the wrong decision at precisely the wrong moment. He'd done it with absolute confidence, with complete certainty, with utter conviction that he was right and everyone who doubted him was wrong. That perhaps is the most terrifying lesson of that day. Not that leaders make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. But that leaders can make catastrophic, civilization-ending mistakes, while being completely certain they're making brilliant decisions. That they can lead nations to destruction while believing until the very end that they're leading them to glory. Hitler had been given a choice on that June morning. Accept reality or cling to assumption. Trust evidence or trust intuition. Respond to what was actually happening, or respond to what he believed should be happening, based on his understanding of strategic logic. He chose wrong, and by the time the magnitude of his error became undeniable, by the time even he might have privately acknowledged his miscalculation, it was far too late to matter. The invasion he dismissed as a feint was the real thing. The reserves he held back to counter a phantom invasion at Pas-de-Calais sat idle, while the actual invasion consolidated and expanded. The clever strategic trap he thought he was setting was actually a trap he'd set for himself. constructed from his own certainty, his own unwillingness to accept that sometimes the obvious answer is the correct answer. And so the liberation of Europe began. Not because the Allies had overwhelmed German defenses through sheer force, though they certainly had the material advantage, but because the man who controlled those defenses made a catastrophic error in judgment, and then lacked the flexibility or humility to recognize and correct it. History turned on that decision. On those crucial hours when the panzers sat motionless and the beachhead grew from a toehold to a foothold to an unshakable base for the final campaign against Nazi Germany, one man, one decision made in absolute confidence and complete error, and the world changed because of it.